certainly Randy Newman was on my radar growing up as a piano player and MTV and whatnot. I became I went to school in North Carolina, and then while in college, recruited to Atlanta. And so I would become like enamored with the South. It was like, this is my new place, and this is a new culture for me, and this is interesting, and it's got all this rich history. And so anyway, so I'm at the record shop and I see it. I think it was right up front too. I just remember popping it on and just going, holy crap, like it really struck me because the opening verse is like in your face. What is he singing over and over? Oh my God. The first 3 songs of the album, to me, feel like the opening of a musical.
This week's request comes from Stephen Fink. In the mid-90s, Atlanta became something of a hotbed for the burgeoning jam band scene. And even though I wasn't gigging at the time, I knew several musicians from the scene, thanks in part to my sister Melody, who was a professional swing dancer at the time. Plus, Colonel Bruce had been a family friend since before I was born. And that's how I met Steve Fink. Steve was the piano player for the Grapes, as well as a contributing songwriter and vocalist. Y'all do remember the Grapes, don't you? These days, Steve and fellow Grapes alum Raman Dawson have a project called 10 Ton Flood, which I highly recommend you all check out. And Steve recommended Good Old Boys by Randy Newman. Short People, I Love L.A., and Toy Story aside, the only full album I've heard by Randy Newman is 12 songs. But that was a very long time ago, and I remember pretty much nothing about it. But I know that the people who love Randy Newman really love Randy Newman, especially those who are also pianists. And I also know that he's considered a songwriter of the highest caliber alongside the likes of Tom Waits and Paul Simon. But nothing about the sound of his songs ever grabbed me enough to want to seek out his music. I'm glad to have this opportunity to dig in a bit. So I'm off to listen to Good Old Boys, and Steve's going to tell you more about why he recommended it.
It's so deliberate. Everything he does seems very, very well thought out. There's nothing about it that seems loose. It's very much arranged. I think I know you as a guy who's not a lyrics first guy as you listen to something, but I think you can't miss these lyrics, and they don't sneak by you. They're like I said, the first verse is in your face about a real thing that really happened, and then just there's more. But those first 3 songs lyrically are incredible. But then there's other songs like "Guilty," which was done by so many people over the years, and "Louisiana," which was done by so many people over the years. So there's some incredibly big songs on this album. But this is the first time the world kind of knew him. This is the first. Yeah, he's had a few albums before that, but this was his first album that kind of, had any sort of commercial success before Short People and all that.
If you're one to unthinkingly sing to yourself when a song gets stuck in your head, then you should know that Good Old Boys by Randy Newman is a dangerous album to get into. Pretty stacked ensemble on this album. On guitar, Ry Cooder and John Platania, who was Van Morrison's longtime guitarist, Al Perkins on pedal steel, Ron Elliott on acoustic guitar, and he was a member of the Beau Brummels, who were kind of a big deal in the folk rock scene in the mid-60s. Even appears on an episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000.
The Beau Brummels.
The Beau Bridges Brummels.
The Beau Brummel Bridges of Madison County. Hey, okay.
On bass, you have Willie Weeks and the Wrecking Crew's own Red Callender, Jim Keltner and Andy Newmark on drums, Bobby Hall on percussion, and Glenn Fry, Don Henley, and Bertie Leadon on backing vocals. In other words, top-tier session cats from LA circa 1974. And after the first couple of listens, I don't know that I'm going to have much to say about the music component of these songs. In general, the sound he gets is kind of a mix between Gershwin-style Great American Songbook, brill-building 50s and 60s pop, and Fats Domino / Alan Toussaint New Orleans piano feel, arranged for rock band and strings. Or to put it more concisely, Randy Newman songs. And like the other Randy Newman I've heard, the music is always unique enough to be immediately identifiable as him, but unobtrusive enough that no note ever feels as if it was anything other than what it should be. And one last thing before I get into this, the subject matter on this album is charged, to say the least. And honestly, the fact that it remains so charged 50 years after it was made says a lot about who we are as a culture, doesn't it? I'm going to try like hell to keep this about the music and not about the social or political context. Yeah, good luck with that. But don't take that to mean that I don't have very strong feelings about these issues. The album starts with Rednecks. There's a ballady kind of intro which discusses the Lester Maddox appearance on Dick Cavett from the point of view of a Maddox sympathizer. And then the song transitions into a mid-tempo New Orleans piano feature thing. But I promise the arrangement is not what you're going to notice about this song. Hoo boy, it do get spicy.
Drink too much, we laugh too loud. Too dumb to make it in no northern town.
Birmingham is about a steelworker from Birmingham, hence the name. And lyrically, it's just exposition, where he works, a bit about his father, his wife, and his dog. So it's kind of assumed that this is the same character that was singing the first song, right? Musically, I mean, like I said earlier, if you've heard Randy Newman's song before, nothing much is going to surprise you here. Immaculately crafted to be just exactly what it is.
Born in Tuscaloosa, he died right here in Birmingham.
But the next song, Marie, that's another story. Beautiful love ballad, even if harmonically somewhat predictable. But the more I think about what is being implied in the lyrics and the character of the narrator, the more it becomes kind of dark. And that leads me to an examination of the main character's humanity, which tests the limits of my own capacity for empathy. Sure gets you thinking.
I'm drunk right now, baby, but I've got to be.
And with the next song, Mr. President, parentheses, have pity on the working man, close parentheses, we kind of start to transition to the other theme of the album, which will come up more on side 2. And that's the South's history with workers' rights. Musically, it does have a 4 to 4 minor to 2/7 to 5/7 structure, which puts it squarely in the Tin Pan Alley style harmonically, though still very much definitely Randy Newman.
We just can't make it by ourselves.
But musically, the most interesting thing on the album happens in the next song, Guilty. The string arrangement is actually dissonant, like legitimately outside the chords entirely. I don't know if I've ever experienced anything so diatonically divergent on anything else I've ever heard from Randy Newman.
From the bombing.
Side 2 starts with Louisiana 1927, the first of 3 songs in a row centered on Huey Long, the populist, leftist former governor of Louisiana who stayed in office as governor even after he was elected to the U.S. Senate.
Good to be the king.
And although he lost his first bid for governor in 1924, he won it in 1928, largely on criticism of the government's handling of the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. Louisiana 1927 paints the picture of the flood and its aftermath in a slow and pensive arrangement that calls attention to the southern roots of what we know today as American music, both for the Stephen Foster-inspired melody and the New Orleans piano arrangement.
Clouds roll in from the north and it start to rain.
Every Man a King was a song adapted from a Huey Long campaign slogan written by Long and Castro Cazzaro, who also wrote the LSU fight song. I love the thought of Randy Newman, Glenn Frey, Don Henley, and Bernie Leadon all crowded around a microphone to sing this one together.
There's castles and clothing and food for all.
The next song, Kingfish, takes its name from the nickname given to Huey Long during the later days of his governorship, but that name originally came from a character from Amos and Andy. What would you do to become famous and dandy? The song starts with kind of a strange contrapuntal figure which implies suspended dominant chord without ever really playing it entirely.
100,000 Frenchmen in New Orleans. In New Orleans, they're Frenchmen everywhere.
But after all the heaviness comes a surprise for me. Naked Man, a song that I know and in fact have played live. I just didn't realize it was on this album. Okay, story time. For quite a while, the Yeti Trio did its rehearsing at a facility called RTM, Rehearse Too Much, part of Avatar Studios. One of the usual characters at RTM was an older gentleman, a lap steel guitarist we called Mr. Bob. Well, Mr. Bob was a fan of the Yeti Trio, and in fact got to be very good friends with Eric. Then Mr. Bob got the idea that he wanted to put together his dream band for a very special one-time performance at a rented theater in Rome, Georgia. And he ended up hiring me and Eric for part of that band. Mr. Bob named the band The Mighty Ass Bites. The gig was a lot of fun and it ended up being terribly meaningful to Mr. Bob, but one of the songs that was on the set that night was Naked Man.
Beware, beware, oh, the naked man.
Fun song. Not sure which Cherokee County is used as the setting for A Wedding in Cherokee County, but the one in Alabama is about an hour and a half from Birmingham, kind of across the border from Rome, Georgia. So I guess that makes a bit of sense. And if you go to the Cherokee County Commission Alabama website, one of the images they show in the header's slideshow of scenic places in the county is a cotton field. So I guess that makes some sense in this context as well. The song is a slow gospel thing, but Southern gospel, right? The old rugged cross and I'll fly away gospel, not trouble of the world, shout sister shout gospel.
Maybe she's crazy, I don't know. Maybe that's why I love her so.
Back on My Feet Again is a bit more New Orleans flavored fun, with slide guitar fills from Ry Cooder all throughout, and the lyrics are the story about a questionable use of cosmetics.
Small cafe on me.
And finally, Rollin', a slow little piano piece with some bowed string tremolo and some light drums with brushes, largely about rationalization.
So sit here in this chair.
Like just about every piece of Randy Newman I've ever heard, the music by itself doesn't leave much of an impression on me, though some of it is quite lovely. Aside from perhaps the artisan's admiration for something well made. Regardless, the songs on Good Old Boys give me a lot to think about. So I've got some thinking to do. Steve will keep you company till I get back.
This was an album that sort of woke me up to the craft of songwriting at a time where I was in an active group and I was certainly had the opportunity to write. It's one of those songs that changed the way that I approached songwriting. But I think for me, what this album means more than anything was sort of this this welcoming to the South, as unpleasant as some of those songs are. And I loved the South and I loved my time in Atlanta. But this was it couldn't have come at a more perfect time for me. Just coming in and sort of falling in love with you guys.
I got a text from Steve the other day. I told him I had just listened to Good Old Boys for the first time, and then added, "You know we're not all like that, right?" Honestly, my first reaction was not entirely unlike my experience of seeing Oh Brother, Where Art Thou in the theater for the first time. And that's kind of a story in and of itself. See, I was in the Netherlands for work, and I was going through something very tough at home. So as cool as it is to spend a couple of weeks in The Hague, the last thing I wanted to do was be away from home. And I guess one of my coworkers saw how pitiful I looked and kind of made it her task to look after me for those 2 weeks. She took me to the pubs, drove me back to her family's home in Belgium for the weekend, even took me to the movies. And see, here's the thing. I was born in Macon, Georgia, but I've moved around a lot in my life. I've lived in 18 different houses and apartments across 11 cities in 3 states. But the farthest north or west I've ever lived in my life is Nashville, Tennessee. In other words, I am a lifelong Southerner. And I had a reaction to seeing a theater full of Dutch folks laughing at Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? The fact that they laughed at the scenarios I could handle, but seeing them laugh at their manner of speech and their living conditions, that started feeling personal. And the first spins of Good Old Boys were like that to me. I felt like Randy Newman was painting all of the South in broad strokes. It kind of got my back up a bit. But the more I listened, the more I realized the subtlety of his songwriting goes a few levels deep. In the song Rednecks, for example, he shines a light on the institutional racism present in all of the U.S., not just the overt racism of Alabama in the late 60s. And then I listened to Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History podcast, where he talks about this album. And I learned that it started as a concept album about a character named Johnny Cutler. And Johnny Cutler, well, is someone that Randy Newman made up. It was based on that Dick Cavett interview I mentioned, right? He heard it and he tried to imagine the entire life of a Lester Maddox fan. And so he wrote the album trying to explore such a person. And the result for me is, well, Good Old Boys sparked some deep and uncomfortable thoughts about where we are as a society and about the limits of my own compassion and empathy. And the music's fairly pleasant too. So my final thoughts, on a scale of 1 to 10, I give Good Old Boys by Randy Newman one big old dog named Dan.
Meanest dog in Alabama. Get him, Dan.
See you next week.